Your eyes give away so much about you, how you're feeling, if you're lying, or whether you've had enough sleep, but also whether you have diabetes, or an autoimmune disease, or even cancer. So why do so many of us take our eyes for granted, as we all sit glued to our screens, blinking half as much as we used to, stressing ourselves out so much our eyes won't stop twitching? We found ourselves in the middle of an epidemic of poor eyesight. Nearsightedness is at an all-time high and rising, with half of people expected to be affected by 2050. We are not caring for our eyes, so I thought it was time to get serious and proactive about eye health. And who better to ask than Joseph Allen, Dr. Eye Health himself. I'm Dr. Karan, and in this podcast, we cut through the BS of modern health advice and tackle the biggest issues in science and medicine. What foods and supplements are best for eye health? Do glasses make your eyes worse? How bad are screens really? And how can you deal with dark circles, bags, or dry eyes? All of these questions answered and more. Enjoy. Joey, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. And, you seem to be the go-to guy for all things eye health and eye stuff related online, because there doesn't seem to be many people in that space. And I wonder if a lot of people have some sort of indifference towards eyes because, people are a bit grossed out by them sometimes when you talk about eye surgery or, ophthalmic surgery and getting things stuck in eyes. It always inspires some degree of cringiness because, it's kind of like gooey and sticky and like squishy. But for me, I'm actually really fascinated by the eye, namely because, you could argue that it's basically an extension of the brain. Certainly the retinal tissue at the back of the eye, which allows us to make sense of the world, is part of the brain. So, what inspired you to go into learning about the eye and operating on the eye and all that?
Wow. Well, thank you so much. And I share that same sentiment about just how amazing the eyes are and its relationship to its connection to the brain, to just understanding our visual world and understanding our reality. A lot of that comes through our visual experience. Kind of how I found my love of the eyes and vision, I think started when I was even a kid. I wore glasses since I was like 6 or 7 years old. And I was kind of a nerdy kid. I sat inside, I read a lot of books, played video games, watched movies. And so I had thick glasses. And so by the time I was in junior high, I really didn't have many friends. And my mom, she pushed me. She's like, Joey, I want you to play a sport. So pick something. And I did what a lot of, I think, at least in the US where I was living, a lot of 13-year-old kids, what do they want to do? They want to do the manly thing. Because I was going to junior high, I got to grow up at that time. So I'm going to play football, like American football. You can't really play tackle sports with thick glasses on, right? Because they get damaged, they could break. You can't see if you don't have them on. So my mother brought me to the local optometrist to get fit for contact lenses. And they're just getting the experience of, better one, better two, instantly seeing sharper, like going into high def mode. It was like black magic to me. I just wanted to know what was going on. And then the experience of getting contact lenses, I could play sports. I started making friends. And then the most important thing at that time, probably girls started paying attention to me. And so it changed my life. So every time I'd see the eye doctor, I'm like, this is amazing. And so that kind of at least started my journey.
You mentioned there that one of the factors that sort of really made you look at the eye in more detail and sort of care about the eye health was around the time you were in college trying to play sports, and obviously girls came onto the scene as well. And that kind of speaks to some of the stigma around glasses, for example. A lot of people face some degree of stigma. They're judged because they wear glasses. They may not be athletic or, for whatever reason, there is this sort of negative connotation about the glasses. And also, you hear this myth that the longer someone wears glasses, the more likely it is to deteriorate their eyesight long term. And I actually, I have short-sightedness in my left eye and long-sightedness in my right eye. And when I was around the age of 11 or 12, I got an eye checkup and they recommended prescription glasses, not very thick lenses, but I did wear them for a while. And actually, I noticed anecdotally for myself that whilst the glasses maybe did enhance my vision a little bit, when I took the glasses off, I noticed that, I don't know, I almost felt better without the glasses. And I felt that every time I then wear the glasses and then took them off, my vision did seem, or I perceived them to be worse. So is there any nuance or discussion to be had around relying or having some dependence on glasses and that worsening your vision long term because of eye strain or whatever it is?
This is a really good question, and just a really interesting thing to discuss. So, in general, wearing glasses are not going to make your eyes worse. I think it feels that way, like your experience where you've had them on, everything seemed crisper, a little bit sharper, and then you took them off and it seemed like things were a little bit worse. And it's really just the adaptation. Suddenly, you're getting used to the world being in a sharper image, and that becomes your new normal. And so then you take the glasses off. Now you're really comparing back and forth of what you are now seeing versus what you used to be seeing. And so it just gives you that mental perception like, oh, these are making my eyes worse. So that's primarily what people are experiencing. There is, getting a little bit more technical, there is an interesting component of glasses, because when you look through glasses, like versus contact lenses, for example, glasses have a kind of a distortion effect, right? There's an optical distortion because of how the lenses are manufactured. And that can create a magnification or minification effect. And in your case, where you have one eye that's farsighted and one eye that's nearsighted, that's called antimetropia. The one eye that's farsighted might have more of a magnification effect of the world around you. And those two images in the brain don't necessarily overlap perfectly. And so they can almost it feels like they almost fight each other. Even though the powers may be correct, this distortion effect by the glasses can kind of make the brain confused. And then what we've learned in this study of myopia or nearsightedness is that standard glasses lenses that have existed for almost forever now, those lenses do have a peripheral effect on the eye. Light, when we're wearing those glasses, is focused to a single perfect point onto the macula of the eye, which is like the bullseye. If I think of it, if I try to describe it like that, if we were in a pub throwing darts, we're trying to hit light to hit the central bullseye. But with standard glasses, for somebody like a child who's nearsighted, the glasses may end up being focused, or the dart would somehow hit behind the wall. Like they'd still hit the dartboard, but it would be on the edges of the dartboard and somehow hit behind the wall. And so because of that, light is being focused technically behind the eye in the periphery. And there's some feedback to the brain knowing that light isn't being focused perfectly. And so perhaps that's signaling the eyeball to grow longer faster, pushing myopia to get worse. So there is a component of that, because we now have new glasses lenses and new contact lenses that are designed to do the opposite and bring that focus plane in the periphery more in front of the dartboard, I'll say that. And that has shown in these devices to slow down myopia.
I mean, yeah, that's really interesting because, just touching on that myopia a bit, you hear these increasing reports in the media and social media and anecdotally that there's this myopia epidemic, more and more young children, especially who are hooked on screens, and even adolescents and adults as well, who are experiencing longer and longer screen times, are having eye strain, and potentially there's this uptick of myopia, of short-sightedness. And that's also coinciding with this changing eyeball structure to maybe as a body's response to compensate, to allow the light to be kind of focused in on that bullseye, as it were, and it's changing shape. And the changing shape is probably making things worse. I mean, is that linked to the thing you were talking about just now?
Yeah, we know that there's several factors. We know that myopia or nearsightedness development is multifactorial, but one area that we've always been looking at is near device, not just near device use, like certainly books, people who've read, historically before smartphones, before computers were invented, we saw this trend as well for people who just had higher education, that read more books, that stayed inside more, right? People who are higher educated, who are either doctors or they went to graduate schools, the longer they went to school, the more likely they were to be nearsighted. And the challenge now is that our world is so digital and everybody's using not only screens, but we spend more time indoors and the screens are getting smaller, right? And so with the smaller screen, our tendency is to move things even closer. And so especially at a young age, between ages of like 5 years old to like age of like 10, 12, there's this accelerated growth of the body for them. Just, they're going through development, the kids grow. And if there's these other signals, whether they're staying inside, they're using a lot of indoor devices, and then genetics plays a role, but the eyeball grows longer with them as they're growing. And if that eyeball grows longer, even 1 millimeter of change in depth equals about 3 diopters of nearsightedness. So there's actually a significant change there. And unfortunately, as the eye grows longer, the eyeball, if you could picture that eyeball stretching longer, there's also increased risk of varying eye diseases. Big ones are like glaucoma, cataracts, certainly eye floaters comes with that, but also the risk of retinal detachment, and then myopic maculopathy, which is...
What is a diopter, just to sort of make sense for people listening?
So the diopter is just the way that we kind of measure the strength of a glasses lens. Around 1 diopter is still mild nearsightedness. Once you start getting to like 3 diopters, 2.5 to 3 diopters, that's what most studies will classify as being moderate nearsightedness. So if you're pretty moderate nearsighted, you are not going to be legal to drive. You're not going to, unless you have glasses or contacts on, you're not going to, certainly a child would not be able to see the board. Like I had a few students even just yesterday in the eye clinic who they were coming in to get eyeglasses for the first time because they were failing in school and they were only even like a 1 diopter. But then if you get to 6 diopters, that's the cutoff where we call it severe myopia. And that's because your risk of all these eye diseases goes up almost exponentially. So if you go from like 6 diopters of myopia, like I'm pretty close to this, unfortunately, you have about a 40 some times greater risk of developing myopic maculopathy as you get older, which is a potentially vision threatening condition. But if you get up to 9 diopters, right, you go from 2 millimeters of length of an eye to 3 extra millimeters, you go up to like 150 times risk.
Wow.
It gets pretty dramatic. And so that's why there's a lot of research into ways we can implement slowing down myopia growth, whether that be with lifestyle or medications or different devices like contacts, glasses, things like that.
It's quite worrying, actually, because, if you think about short-sightedness or myopia, it's a seemingly benign thing. You think, okay, I have some, some mild vision issues, but I guess the real terror there is how something so benign, or at least on the surface benign, changes the shape of your eyeball, which then triggers this cascade of problems, which then increases your risk of other very serious conditions like glaucoma and maculopathy, which, are really harmful. So it's kind of like, that sentinel sign to maybe get checked out on a frequent basis. Because I guess, similar to, dental health or oral health, people only realize it's a problem when it's too late. And I guess a similar account can be had with the eyes as well. We take it for granted. We look at things, we abuse our eyes, we subject it to all sorts of things, both in the environment and also, all this light and screens. And then once we start failing in our vision, that's when we're like, oh God, we need to get it checked out. And it's probably in that irreversible stage by then, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you said that because it is so true. And eye doctors have been trying to say this forever, but it's in our human nature to be more reactive, right? And in most cases, when people do start notice their vision failing, by the time they come in, it's like, oh darn, well, this has already been set in for maybe a decade. I wish you would have came in, 5 years or 10 years earlier. And that's kind of the classic world that we kind of battle. So that's why I'm trying to make so many social media posts and things about, ways you can be proactive and encouraging people to realize that eyes and your eye health, your vision is so much more than just, I think I see well, I see just fine. It's like, no, there's way more going on.
On that point of lifestyle and preventative strategies, you mentioned earlier that when it comes to eye health, as with all aspects of health, it's multifactorial. There's no one panacea which can cure everything. So along that line, if we had to break down into little segments and discuss each one, what are some facets of lifestyle that people could adjust or modulate to at least reduce the risk of eye problems and improve their eye health from an early age?
So we already kind of covered the one need for seeing an eye doctor. Screen time, can we kind of mention that? Spending less time indoors. There is a component of the research that finds that kids, especially young kids who spend more time outdoors, at least 2 hours a day, have a decreased risk of developing myopia. There seems to be some sort of an offset mechanism that we don't fully understand. Is it just sunlight exposure? Is it being in an environment that is more wide open, right? Like if you're on a field of some kind versus being, indoors in a small apartment. So we just try to encourage people to get some natural sunlight, get outside. At that same point, UV light exposure, you do have to be cautious of the harsh energies of the sun.
Yeah.
So that is another health component, especially for aging eyes, protecting the eyes from harsh UV light, especially in the peak hours, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. The other major thing is diet.
Yeah.
The retina in the back of the eye is one of the most highly metabolic places in your entire body. And so getting plenty of antioxidants, anti-inflammatories naturally in your body, that's going to be super important, right? We know that's good for the heart, it's good for the brain, it's also going to be good for the eyes. The other components are probably like, stress, getting good sleep, making sure to stay hydrated, all those fundamentals. Those are all really important for keeping the eyes healthy.
I mean, it's interesting that you just touched on the sunlight and being outdoors. That's really interesting because I guess when someone is, outdoors, naturally they're exposed to UV light and sunlight. And we know that, in a specific concentration, sunlight is great for setting your biological clock, your circadian rhythm. It can also, in excess, as all UV rays can, it can damage DNA. And obviously the eyeballs doesn't really have a major protective layer like the skin does to protect it and the retinal tissue against this high energy UV rays. So I guess, finding that balance between soaking up some of that sunlight to almost entrain your brain and your eyeball as well. Is there any specific research into the connection between sunlight and eye health? Because as far as I'm aware, the main research that I've seen is that, and it was only discovered, I think, a few decades ago, that we have this kind of third type of pigment in our eyes, which is specifically linked to telling us if it's day or night. And even someone who's blind, who obviously can't see the sunlight, can almost have a sense of day and night because of that light receptor in the back of the eye. So even if they can't see color and vision, they can tell it's light or day. So I guess from that point of view, I think it's the melanopsin pigment. It's key to get some sunlight so you continue to train your eye and your body.
Yeah, so you touched on a few things. First, there is quite a bit of research looking into the effect of like different wavelengths of light and how it affects eye health and risk of certain eye diseases, right? We've known people who spend more time outside without UV light protection, especially people who are on like water. So like fishermen over the years, people who don't wear sunglasses or hats, they more or less get more UV light on the surface of the eye, and they do have a higher rates of age-related eye diseases like cataracts, as well as macular degeneration. There have been newer publications in the last few decades that maybe question that. So it's not fully clear exactly what's going on, but most of UV light is absorbed by the front surface of the eye called the cornea. Still, you can get photokeratitis, you can have pterygium pinguecula, these growths that grow on the eye from UV light exposure. Inside the eye, you then have the lens, and the lens absorbs a lot of UV light, and that's why people can develop some forms of cataracts from UV light exposure. Then the other concern is blue light, or blue light or purple light, violet light. We now term HEV light or high energy visible light. And that does get through because you can see the color blue, but that reaches the retina in the back. So there's a lot more interest in like, hey, maybe it's not as much a UV light because not much UV light technically gets to the retina. It's more of this high energy visible light that is getting to the retina that carries a lot more energy, and that might be stressing out the retinal tissue. And that might be contributing more to macular degeneration. And then, like you pointed out, about a decade ago, we discovered this new photoreceptor. It's called an IPRGC, or an intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cell. That's the fancy term. It only accounts for about 1% of the photoreceptors in the back of the eye. And you're right, they do not send vision to our brain. They just detect if there's light present and how intense that light is. And it does play a role in speaking to different areas of our brain, like the superior colliculus, which helps communicate to different parts of the brain to control your circadian rhythm. It also has an influence on metabolism. And there's a few other factors that they're studying and trying to better understand. And this special photoreceptor inside the eye that it controls these factors is more sensitive to wavelengths of blue light. And so that's why they're doing studies into, blue light glasses. Does that affect your sleep cycle? And depending on the type of lens that's used in those studies, they are finding an effect. That's why there's a lot of concerns about screens at nighttime and people getting a fresh dose of light in the morning as being positive for resetting the circadian rhythm cycles. So that's kind of where that interest lies, in is trying to better understand this connection between this special photoreceptor and how it communicates to the brain.
I think, on that point you mentioned about blue light blocking glasses, I guess most of the research that's been done into them, some have been industry funded, some say they do help, some say they don't help. And I guess the results of those studies are a bit equivocal right now. You can't say for sure they do or don't help, beyond maybe saying avoid blue light in the form of screens and TVs, etc. If you're using screens and TVs and blue light blocking glasses, it makes sense that they'll just cancel each other out and you're not really doing yourself any justice. So for someone who maybe naturally just in the couple of hours before bed doesn't use screens or watch Netflix, is there any need for them to have blue light blocking glasses? And in what consideration would someone even consider buying blue light glasses, if at all?
So right now, you're correct that the research on blue light glasses is kind of all over the place. Yeah, some are industry funded, others are just done really poorly. I think it's difficult to study something where you don't have they don't have like a control, right? It's hard to make blue light glasses where the person who's using it or the people who are studying it can't tell that the lenses are yellow. So there's a lot of issues with the research. What we do know, kind of like what you pointed out, is that yes, blue light comes from screens. However, the further you push the screen back, there's what's called the inverse square law, the less light you're going to get to the eye. So the blue light may actually not be affecting the eye that much. The power density that we have in our digital screens are nowhere compared to the energy that you get from the sun. So sunlight is going to give you the most blue light you've ever had throughout the day. Within like 5 minutes, you'll get more blue light from the sun than you will from spending a whole day in front of a digital screen. So there's a lot of kind of debates. I think the base thing is, if you do your best job with lifestyle of like, hey, I'm going to wind down at the end of the day. I'm going to put away digital devices. I'm going to keep my phone in the living room. I'm going to charge it in a different room overnight. I'm going to settle down. I'm going to read a book before bed, stretch, do something. Then you probably do not need blue light glasses to help with your sleep cycles. There's also this thought that yes, while some research is showing that blue light glasses can help with the sleep cycle before bed if you're staring at an iPad or your phone, the content that you're digesting on your phone before bed is probably more stimulating to your brain to be awake than just the blue light effect on your melatonin production. So I know some of the doctors who are doing the research on blue light glasses, and I asked them, and they're like, "Yeah, that has an effect," but they don't even recommend blue light glasses to their kids. So
Yeah, well, there you go. That's from the horse's mouth.
yeah, so I've read the research, and I think there can be a place. Anecdotally, we have a lot of people who just claim that they love the feeling of the blue light glasses, especially because of eye strain reasons on the computer. And the research on eye strain and blue light glasses is, again, mostly they're not well done studies. It's hard to study eye strain within a 2-hour period in a research study when most of us are on a screen for over 13 hours a day, right? It's like asking somebody who's been doing marathons and training for a marathon for years, and then saying, "Hey, I want you to try this new shoe, but I only want you to run 1 mile in it. I want to see if this affects, like how your feet feel after doing it for 1 mile when you're used to running 26." It's hard to study that. But with eye strain, right now the research is inconclusive of how blue light glasses affect eye strain. But I know for myself and other doctors I've talked to around the world, a lot of people just find them comfortable. And perhaps it could be just this calming effect. It could be maybe helping with almost photophobia or light sensitivity from the screen. So there may be some benefit for people who want to wear it there, but it's still, if you look at the clinical research, it's still not conclusive.
On the other spectrum from blue light, there's been some patchy evidence and maybe emerging evidence that other wavelengths of light, namely red, oranges, and yellows, can have some sort of beneficial effect on general brain/eye health, particularly at nighttime. So I've read some reports that if you were using some sort of light at night, maybe the red lights will be better at, avoiding any, negative impacts on your melatonin levels, on stimulating you, etc. And even there is some research, certainly from a neurological perspective, that suggests that, the sort of oranges and yellow wavelengths that you see in the sunset in the late afternoon or early evening could also have some sort of calming effect on your nervous system as well. Is there, any high quality evidence to back those sort of claims up?
I can't say there'd be super high quality evidence. I think some of it is kind of speculative, right? They're kind of jumping to a few conclusions. However, we do know, again, this special receptor in the retina, this IPRGC, is more sensitive to blue light. It is sensitive to all wavelengths of light, but it's not triggered as sharply by the yellows and by the reds. And so that's sort of the idea that, hey, if you do have lights in the evening, even if you're not on the screen, some indoor lighting is now switched to LEDs, and LEDs do give off more of this blue light. So perhaps switching your lights inside to more of a calming yellow, kind of amber color, that again won't trigger those receptors as much, and your melatonin will be able to start producing more naturally. So that's probably the most concrete evidence we have.
One interesting aspect that I just want to expand on is the aspect of diet that you brought up. And you mentioned polyphenols and antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds in your diet. Now, we know these things are great for general body health, so it makes sense that by extension, it would be good for eye health as well. And, it really makes me chuckle because this takes me back to one of my favorite stories from history was, about this myth created by the food ministry, by the British government in World War II. And they suggested that, eating carrots improves your eyesight, supposedly as a tactic to avoid German bombers finding out about their radar technology. And, even I think kids were not having their ice creams anymore, and they had carrots with sticks on, like, a stick with a carrot on. And it just speaks to, yes, while there is some molecule of truth in that carrots can help you see in the dark if you were deficient in vitamin A, you get that from beta carotene, it can't improve your eyesight beyond a certain baseline level. So if someone was looking at, certain food groups to kind of focus on for eye health, what sort of things, is in that sort of bag of food?
I love that you shared that story because I dug really deep into that research, and I even tried to find any evidence in the available literature of like, hey, is there any research to show that taking more higher levels of beta carotene or vitamin A can improve your eyesight, right? Really improve a clinically significant change. And really there's not. If anything,
Okay.
not necessarily with carrots, because carrots, the beta carotene, your body has a pretty good process of turning that and regulating how much vitamin A is being produced from beta carotene. But people who eat too much vitamin A, whether it's from supplements or they eat too much liver, for example, because you can get vitamin A, high concentrations of vitamin A from liver, people can have hypervitaminosis. They can actually have too much vitamin A, and that can hurt the eye. So,
Wow.
so kind of interesting. But looking at food specifically for being beneficial for the eye, other than eating like carrots or sources of beta carotene, because beta carotene still has an antioxidant effect that's really good for the eyes. But green leafy vegetables, by far. I mean, not surprising knowing how they can affect other parts of the body, but kale, spinach, arugula, the dark leafy greens. And that's primarily for two reasons. There is some nitric oxide release when you're eating these sort of green leafy vegetables. That's good for your blood vessels in the eye, especially for people who are at risk of diabetes, high blood pressure, those sort of things. But more so because green leafy vegetables have high concentrations of two other carotenoids. They're called lutein and zeaxanthin. Lutein and zeaxanthin are of the 600 plus carotenoids in nature. They deposit almost exclusively in the eye, and then they also affect the brain in some ways, as what research is showing.
Wow.
These carotenoids kind of have three roles within the eye. They work as a shield. They actually deposit in front of the photoreceptors, and they work because they're kind of a yellow-orange pigment. They absorb the high energy visible light, the blue light. And so they have a protective effect. And then they are strong antioxidants and strong anti-inflammatories. And
Amazing.
when they've done research, they find people who ingest higher levels of these pigments, and we can measure it in the eye clinic with some special tools. People who have higher amounts, they have less risk of going on to develop aging eye conditions like cataracts and macular degeneration.
Wow.
They also have found improvements in eyesight. Some components of eyesight like contrast sensitivity. So people who, again, have higher levels of these carotenoid pigments, they can detect blacks and whites and shapes a bit easier, a bit faster. And they also have less glare. So driving at nighttime or seeing glare off of water, that's reduced. They're less bothered by it. And then people can have less problems with light sensitivity and or photo stress recovery. So there's some components that are beneficial to your eyesight even from having higher levels of this.
So you mentioned things like the beta carotene, zeaxanthin, lutein, which are these anti-inflammatory compounds which are specifically, more biased towards being beneficial for the eye. Would that also work in a supplement form as well? If someone was considering supplementing these things because they didn't have a good enough diet containing all of these things, or is it something about those compounds being packaged with the nutrients in natural food which make them more beneficial?
I always support trying to go the natural food way first. There is a question of bioavailability, even though we know green leafy vegetables have a high abundance of these carotenoids. You need to be eating it with some form of oil or fat because they are fat soluble. Yeah. There is also some question of farming practices, if perhaps some of these nutrients have shifted depending on where you're getting them or what time of the season. So there's some question there. But a lot of studies have looked at supplementation and if supplementation has this effect, and they have found that that is true. So a lot of eye vitamins that you find at the store will have lutein and zeaxanthin in them. You can purchase just lutein, zeaxanthin as a supplement on its own. The research still hasn't said like this is the daily requirement. They haven't come to that conclusion, but the research for an optimal level is showing somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 milligrams a day for lutein. And then zeaxanthin is somewhere between 2 and 4 milligrams a day. That's where the current research is at.
Now, most people would, consume this via food or supplements in the form of oral supplements. But in the context of the eye, is there any role for, eye drops as supplements, which could be beneficial for eye health?
That's an interesting question. I've seen some products online that kind of sell themselves as that, even like lutein eye drops. And
Wow.
no, there's no evidence of that being beneficial at this time. There are some eye drops that have antioxidants in them, but those are more to support the front surface of the eye, because the tear film actually isn't just water. It actually has electrolytes and proteins, and there's oxidative stress that occurs on the surface of the eye. So some eye drops are meant that way to help heal the surface, but they're not going to absorb and get into the retina from just putting an eye drop in. I think one other food thing to kind of mention is the role of fatty fish, and specifically that of omega-3s and their effect on the eye. Most of the research on dietary benefits for the eye has found that more of a Mediterranean diet does reduce the risk of aging eye diseases. Some are, green leafy vegetables on their own, eating at least around 3 servings a week can reduce about a 25% reduction in risk. Oily fish twice a week can be around a 20 to 21% reduced risk of conditions like macular degeneration. But if you have them together, there's a synergistic effect, and they have found that there's around a 40% reduction in risk of progressing or getting these severe forms of eye disease when you eat that type of diet. With that being said, I know you're kind of like you asked if green leafy vegetables versus supplement, are they equivocal? So far, the vast majority of research on omega-3s and fish, they find that people who eat whole forms of fish seem to have a less risk than people who are just taking omega-3 supplements. They don't fully understand it yet. There's sort of, maybe some research is starting to make sense of it, but they find that people, again, who eat oily fish at least twice a week have a reduced risk versus people who are just taking omega-3 supplements.
I know you recently looked into the potential effects or the research into intermittent fasting on eye health. What are the effects of different dietary protocols, and specifically based on some of your analysis, intermittent fasting, and how can that possibly influence eye health?
Yeah, so I've been studying nutrition as a component to better understand eye health and ocular physiology for several years now. Intermittent fasting is kind of I can't say there's a lot of research on it, but there are specific studies that have looked at intermittent fasting and its effect on retinal disease, on optic nerve disease, on dry eye. And so they've looked at specific conditions. They have found, they aren't 100% sure why, but when people do fasting protocols, there seems to be almost this mechanism that turns on in some cells that almost protects it from stress. For example, optic nerve stress, people who are at risk of glaucoma, they may have elevated eye pressures. And people who may be in this fasting stage, even though their eye pressure is a little bit elevated, it doesn't take as much damage as it would when they are not in a fasting stage. This is mostly done in mice studies right now, not in human clinical trials, but still really fascinating that they're finding these kind of conclusions. Same thing for people with macular degeneration. They don't find as fast of a degradation. And then for dry eye, and dry eye is really over the place. It seems like it may help in some situations, but it could also make things worse in other situations. So it's still not super conclusive, but it seems like fasting may have an application. Obviously, we need more human clinical studies on it, but it's really interesting to look at that and how the cellular machinery, mainly things like mitochondria in the cells, may be turned on or protected. I think, again, people have been fasting for a long time. It's, maybe at least kind of theorized that human diets tens of thousands of years ago, we would fast because we would had to move and find food and hunt food. So we would go through these stages of almost like, feast and famine. And so our bodies kind of learn to survive in that environment. Right now, if you dig in, I don't know how much you've read into intermittent fasting, but there's a lot of different protocols, right? Yeah. Lots of different research is looking into, hey, do we need to fast, for 12 hours a day? Do we need to fast for 16? Do we need to fast for 3 days? So it's hard for me to say, is there a perfect protocol for that? But I think if someone's interested in looking at intermittent fasting and seeing how it affects them, I would just ask your doctor, do more research into the best ways to do it. It's hard for me to say you'll notice a big change in your vision, but it may have an effect, especially if you are overweight and you lose weight. Maybe you'll see a shift in your vision.
And one of the things you mentioned there was, briefly, was about dry eyes. And, that's surprisingly common in this day and age for multiple reasons. One of the reasons may be, imposed by ourselves. I mean, we're kind of looking at screens all the time and we're not blinking enough, and maybe that's drying out our eyes. Rise of autoimmune conditions, various autoimmune conditions like Sjogren's disease, for example, may be linked with dry eyes. Various other lifestyle factors may be, causing that as well. Is there something, simple beyond maybe, I don't know, using artificial tears that someone can do? Because, the dry eyes, whilst it's irritating and painful in many cases, I guess the role of tears is also a little bit underrated. And I was shocked when I found out a few years ago that there are actually several different types of tears, that it's not only like a reflexive tear, which can clean up any debris on the surface of the eye, but also as a form of analgesia, the sort of emotional tears we get can provide some painkiller type effect. And even, a third type of tear, which, may provide some kind of immune function as well to kind of, lubricate the eye, provide some immune effect as well, because, the eye is a relatively, low immune state as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. The dry eye and the tear film is beautifully complex. I do a lot of specialty care for dry eye in the eye clinic. So your tear film, like you were saying, does have different components to it, and there's different sources of the tears. So we have our emotional sort of tears, and then we also have just our normal day-to-day kind of our basal, is what we call it, our basal tear secretion. And something that's really beautiful about the tears is that if you ask, like, how does your body know how much tears to make? Just like us sitting here, how does it know? And one of the reasons why is because the surface of your eye has some of the most nerve endings in your entire body. And they're constantly sampling, not just like mechanical movements on the eye, it's constantly sampling temperature. It's constantly sampling, like, not just, hey, I walked outside and it's like, freezing temperatures out in the winter. There is a receptor for that, but more so it's constantly sampling the ambient temperature in the room. Is there wind hitting your eye, and how fast the tears are evaporating from the surface? Because that little evaporation, just like your sweat, right? It changes and helps control the temperature of your skin. These receptors sense, hey, the temperature dropped by like 2 degrees all of a sudden, make more tears because it's evaporating too quickly. So it's really quite beautiful. The tear film is being thrown off for a lot of people. I love that you mentioned autoimmune conditions is on the rise. We know that. There are some autoimmune conditions that are associated with dry eye, but probably the biggest factor, and you also mentioned it, is the fact that we're all on screens. And we've found that people who spend more time on screens, we blink less. And it's not only that we blink less times, but our blinks are not as complete. Our eyelids don't close 100% of the way when we're on devices. And it's kind of, it's like a focus factor if you think about it. And they found that with books, that people who are studying intensely, even on a book, like not even on a computer screen, if they're studying something really intensely, they have the same thing. Their eyes are focused. They're trying to take in information. And because they're almost like in a hunter mode, they don't want to lose the information. So their eyes have learned to not blink as much and to not close all the way. And so when people read more of a relaxing book, something they're not really studying hard, they're just sort of like, leisurely reading, then their blink rate isn't bothered quite as much. But it's still not as solid or regular rates of blinking or complete blinking as they are if we're just in conversation, hanging out. And you may think, that's not a problem. I don't have dry eyes when I'm on the computer. It is still there. And you have these inflammatory cascades because when there's subtle damage to the surface of the eye, subtle dryness, the body throws out inflammatory proteins to try and fix it and heal it. Just like if you bump your knee on a coffee table or something, you get some swelling, right? There's local inflammation to try and fix the acute problem. But on a long enough timeline, the amount of inflammatory proteins on a chronic scale eventually break down and stop healing the eye, and they start making it worse. And so you end up in a vicious cycle of dry eye where it becomes a perpetual thing. It's like a winding staircase going down. It just gets worse and worse, and it's hard to break the cycle. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of people end up with more severe dry eye.
So what can someone do to kind of rectify this?
So number one is just being aware that you're spending a lot of time on screens. There are some programs now that some companies are investing in, but you can even invest in it as a consumer. That if you're on a desktop screen, it'll use your webcam and it'll track your blinking while you're on the computer. It'll also track your posture to remind you. It'll actually stop you what you're doing. They're like, you'll see a little eyeball blink, and it'll tell you, hey, you need to blink more often. So that's a component. Some people, if you're working indoors, whether it be at home or at work, having humidifiers in the room can be a little bit of a benefit. Certainly using eye drops can have a therapeutic role more than just relieving dry eye symptoms, but you have to be consistent with it. And you ideally want to be using something that's preservative free, because a lot of eye drops that have preservatives, the common preservatives that are used in eye drops, they're great at stopping the eye drop bottle from getting contaminated, but those preservatives are known to be toxic to the surface of the eye. So it's like a dual-edged sword, right? And then, of course, there are warm compresses. That's a great thing to be doing. Warm compresses like a spa therapy, getting heat to the eyelids.
Yeah.
And that helps because there's oil glands in the eyelids that people don't often know about. These oil glands produce a little bit of oil every time you blink, and those oils prevent your tears from evaporating. But we find that whether it's due to age, due to medication use, hormone changes, lack of use of these glands, perhaps because the blinking rates are going down, that these oils, they solidify within the gland. It's like having a pimple of the eyelids. Yeah. And these even though you're blinking, these oils aren't releasing. So heat can be a method to melt the oils that have solidified and gotten trapped in those glands and get them to release. And so doing warm compresses has been around for a long time as kind of a at-home therapy, but it does have utility with helping with dry eye.
I sort of stick to this, 20-20-20 rule that I've imposed on myself. So say I'm, reading something, revising something, or just kind of intensely focused on my screen, for example. Every 20 minutes, I'll impose a break upon myself for at least 20 seconds, and I'll look 20 feet away. Every 20 minutes, 20 seconds, 20 feet. So for me, that breaks the screen time and allows me to blink. But also, I guess, in terms of eye strain, stops me with that narrow focus and my pupil, being just purely focused on that. And, those muscles around the eye focusing on that one point. I'm looking at something in the distance, in the horizon, so I get a wider view. So my, eyeball can essentially relax.
Absolutely. So the 20-20-20 rule, like you mentioned, has been around for some time now. Interestingly enough, there is a publication that they did just a few years ago that more or less disproved it. Okay. It's still rooted in good recommendations for lifestyle ergonomics. We should be taking breaks. We should be taking breaks from computer use at least 20 to 25 minutes just to get up, stretch the body, improve your posture, get a drink of water, use the restroom. As far as relaxing the eyes, they find that you have to wait. You have to actually give yourself a little more time. You have to give yourself at least 90 seconds. So maybe closer to 2 minutes of a break looking out the window. And it's not, that's what I try to point out to people. It's not taking a break from the desktop just to look at your phone for a few minutes.
Yes.
You want to get up and look outside, go for a quick walk. Yeah, do something like that. That's going to change your focus, how you're using those muscles. And that may cut not only the eye strain, but kind of refresh your mind. And so you're going to end up finding yourself being more productive throughout the day too, just because you're not like sinking into this one project constantly.
I realize that, previously you mentioned that one of the lifestyle factors that we should look to regulate, which we all should look to regulate, is stress. And I'm interested on the role of how stress impacts the eye. And certainly I'm seeing a lot more in myself, but probably online people as well. You see an increased number of people attesting to the fact that they're developing, these random eyelid twitches or eye twitches, the myopia, as they call it, where, you might just be walking down the streets or looking at some TV and you notice just like either top or bottom eyelid goes into a spasm. And it may resolve within a minute or, even a few seconds. And I feel that although there might be a lot of factors which could contribute to that, a bulk of that is probably lifestyle related stress.
Yeah, 100%. And I know you see people with this, right? Classically, this is known as kind of the med student disease because usually students who are going through like medical school or higher education are very stressed out. They often are not sleeping very well. They're fatigued and sometimes taking like excessive amounts of caffeine, right? They're like sitting at a coffee house all day studying. And really that's the main causes of it. There is potential if somebody's having their both eyelids and their whole face is spasming. It's not just the eyelids, but the whole face is kind of spasming. That's a different condition called a blepharospasm. But this twitching, this myokymia, is common, and it's usually just due to high levels of stress. You're not sleeping well enough, and you're drinking too much stimulants like a caffeine. So if you've ever having that, someone's listening, watching this, and then they know, okay, just do a self-regulatory check. What's going on? Are you drinking a lot of caffeine? And I remember in college, I had this for months, and I wasn't drinking caffeine. I was not a coffee or tea drinker. And my doctor was telling me, "Oh, you're just stressed out." I'm like, "I'm not stressed. This is great. Like, I'm in college, I'm living my life." And then I went home and did like a self-check on just like a journal. I started writing down every little task I'm trying to control in my life. Oh, I've got these tests. I've got this I'm managing. I'm applying to these schools. I have to work how many hours a week. I have to be at this sort of event. I'm running this. I'm a leader in this organization. And as I listed that, I realized, oh my God, I'm super stressed. And so I think we can become so ingrained and used to our level of stress that we sometimes, there's a disconnect between what we think we're going through versus reality. So I think that's a good check. Stress affects the eyes in many different ways. There is some medical conditions, one called central serous retinopathy. This usually affects A-type personalities. This can be due to endogenous or cortisol from your own adrenal glands for people who are really stressed out, or it can be from exogenous cortisol if people are taking steroids of any kind. But some people are more susceptible, but it causes the retina itself to swell with fluid. It more or less creates a blister in the back of the eye, which can make your vision really blurry. It can distort your vision to kind of make it look like it's magnified and straight lines are now wavy. Thankfully, in those conditions, usually reducing stress or taking the excess cortisol away, it usually improves on its own within 3 months. For some people, it can be chronic, and then we have to be more concerned and maybe consider treating with different medications and things. But that's one concern about stress. There is also some publications on glaucoma and eye pressure, because we find that people they actually did a few well-done studies on people with glaucoma, elevated eye pressure. They had half the group continue just medications for controlling glaucoma. They took the other half, said, hey, continue with the medication, but let's also have you do meditation. They did mindfulness meditation every day for like 3 weeks. And they tracked not only their eye pressure, but other stress biomarkers, and everything came down. And the eye pressure even dropped by an additional 25-30%, which is on par for medications. So while it's not a replacement therapy for glaucoma, it is pretty fascinating to see that relationship. So stress can affect your eye pressure and potentially a risk for glaucoma as well.
I found that, one of the sort of additional aspects of stress, which may be, a consequence of stress and then inducing poor sleep, is, these dark circles or eye bags under people's eyes. And I remember the day before the marathon that I ran, I didn't sleep as well as I wanted to because of the stress of running my first ever race. And then after the marathon, even though I was happy, my body was in this kind of like stress state because of the exertion it had gone under. And I was given these kind of these eye gel masks to wear, these kind of hydrating, anti-puffing, whatever gels, and I have never worn them before, but I just tried them, the next night, and they did nothing. Is there any evidence behind any of these eye mask therapies that are rooted in science at all, or are they just another gimmick, another fad in the beauty cosmetic industry?
There are some ingredients that are used in some different eye creams and kind of those sort of eye bag masks that do have a benefit for reducing puffiness specifically. Some other ones can work with helping reduce pigmentation, but the puffiness often has to do with fluid imbalance, like salt imbalance, sleep, potentially cortisol relationships. But most research finds that this eye bags are going to improve on their own within 2 hours after waking up anyway. Cold compresses, just getting cold to the eyelids for about 10 to 15 minutes. Try not to go over 15 minutes. It actually can cause a vasodilator effect to make things worse. But up to about 15 minutes can have a reduction in swelling, just like you putting cold on a swollen knee, for example. Some of these medications, if you ever look at the ingredients, there likely will say caffeine in them. And caffeine can vasoconstrict to make the blood vessels smaller. And if it's due to allergies, if it's just due to swelling, of fluid accumulation, it can have some benefit there, at least temporarily. But we often have people come to the clinic who have chronic eye bags, and that's usually comes with older age. And this happens more often due to collagen changes as we get older. There's some tissue around the eye that holds fat back around the eye and into the orbit. And so as the septum, it's called a septum, but it's mostly collagen. As collagen, as you get older, it becomes lax, right? Your face starts to droop a little bit. And so the fat pads start to push forward. And in those cases, it's usually best route to go see an oculoplastic surgeon because they can adjust the fat pads and the face a little bit. So then people can have more of a permanent fix to it. So it's a little bit mixed. There are some products, but they work temporarily. And then if somebody has pigmentation, right? 'Cause some people come in and they don't just have swollen eyelids. It's because their eyelids seem dark, and it's because of pigmentation around the eyelids. And that could be genetic. It could be environmental factors. And so doctors have to assess really what's going on with the pigment and if a medication will be effective, or if, again, they have to look into like a procedure, like various laser procedures to remove the pigment. So that's a different thing.
So I guess, our theme of this conversation has been trying to be more proactive when it comes to eye health and not leaving it to the last minute when you see a deterioration in your vision or eye health. So with that in mind, how often should someone maybe seek to get an eye test or, do things at home to be proactive about that, and maybe even reach out to their doctor or do any self-tests at home? How frequently throughout a year should someone be doing that?
Yeah, I don't know what the recommendations are, and every different part of the world may have a different health organization and what they recommend. Here in the United States, the American Optometric Association even did a recent multidisciplinary, they invited doctors and specialists to all different parts of healthcare and assess the clinically based evidence. And they do find that an eye exam at least every 1 to 2 years is going to be recommended, even if someone thinks they have perfect eyesight. Most doctors will recommend a yearly eye exam, mainly because we can catch so many different, not only eye diseases, but systemic diseases with an eye exam, whether it be things like diabetes or high blood pressure, high cholesterol. We can catch autoimmune conditions in the eye, certainly neurological things like brain tumors. We can catch that in the eye. I've had patients with anemia that have come in that they had no idea until I did an eye exam. Liver conditions. There's a lot of things that we can catch. And so even if someone just says, I don't really need glasses, I see just fine. It's like, you actually might instantly be able to go from seeing well to seeing high definition. You can instantly improve your life. So I think it's worthwhile, especially if someone's listening and they haven't had an exam for a few years. It's probably worthwhile to at least go get a checkup and make sure things are in their top performing condition.
I guess whilst, we still have yet to prove that the, eyes might be the window to the soul, we at least know that it's an indicator to all manner of other health conditions, as you just outlined there. So, I really, in this kind of online plague of misinformation and pseudoscience, I want to thank you for coming on here and just giving so much, good information about eye health so people can be proactive, because I know people are not taking care of their eyes. They just use it as a pair of goggles to see the world, but we should be caring about it a little bit more. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks again to Dr. Joseph Allen. Have you noticed any weird or interesting things going on with your eyes? And will you start taking eye health more seriously after this? Let me know in the comments below. Subscribe so you don't miss the weekly Dr. Karan Explores podcast, and I'll see you googly-eyed munchkins next week.